Good morning, Randy. How are you?
Good. Um, it's always nice to sort of get away from talking about marching band on these coffee talks occasionally, and we've done that. But recently we had our marching arts monthly webinar where we had Jeremy Spicer from Texas on, and he was a great guest and very eloquent talking about show design. And so I thought maybe we'd hit a few of those bullet points today just to keep them at the forefront of everyone's mind who's in the midst of designing for marching band, especially if you're doing it on your own. And there were some really, really good recommendations from Jeremy. So one of the things that got brought up right away was this idea of, and I call it the chicken and egg theory, what comes first, the visual concept or the musical concept? And Jeremy put it so well, he talked about the fact that, it could be either or. Sometimes the inspiration might be the music, and sometimes the inspiration might be the visual concept. So what do you think about that, Richard?
I agree completely. I think, I was just on a conference call with a group that I write for, a Zoom call, and we were talking about the exact same thing. The visual folks were saying, well, we have this thought, we have this idea. And so I immediately started thinking, okay, what music would work with that concept? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If they have a surefire idea that they know is going to work visually, then let's put some great music to it and let's turn it into a total effect.
Yeah, I think sometimes we have to simplify it down to storytelling. I mean, it's, storytelling can be done through music, programmatic music, which most marching band is obviously programmatic in some way because it's the soundtrack for whatever is going on visually.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think of it as storytelling, every good story has a premise. Every good story has great pacing. Every good story has, that wonderfully crafted ending. And so if we're looking at show design in that way, then it becomes easier to kind of frame in our mind. And I know we've said this several times, you don't necessarily have to write the whole thing in one sitting, or develop the whole thing in one sitting. In fact, there are many times where it's better to kind of let things germinate a little bit,
right,
simmer a little bit, right?
Absolutely. And especially after you've had a meeting and you've made some decisions, I think it's always important to say, okay, it sounds like we've got a consensus. Let's take 2 or 3 days. Let's think about this. Let's go through this again in our minds. And then if anyone thinks of any red flags or anything that might get in the way of this happening, then send us an email or whatever. We'll get back together and figure this out. But yeah, just be careful not to agree with everyone on the page, and then all of a sudden a week later you're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not sure this works visually, not sure this works for percussion, not sure this works for our color guard, etc. So just I really like what you just said about letting things settle and germinate just a little bit, so people can kind of get a good feel for what's really going to go on.
Yeah, and if you're going to use pre-published stuff from Hal Leonard or wherever you're getting your marching band music, if you're not able to afford a custom arrangement, it's okay to make adjustments for solos and things. That's going to be okay to do. If you don't have that baritone soloist that's in the arrangement, the canned arrangement, so to speak, you can change it. Those arrangers are going to want your group to sound as good as they possibly can, and I don't think they're going to have too much of an issue if you change a trombone solo to a flute solo or whatever you've got to do
right
to make it work for your group. It's very, very important. And we all know that, sometimes things change. I mean, you may think you were going to have 12 flutes and it was going to be a great flute feature, and then you ended up with 6. So do what you have to do to make those things work. And that's why, if you kind of have a plan for giving yourself a 2-week window to kind of review what it is that you've crafted so far, instead of just feeling like you have to get everything done, it can make a big difference. Because again, until you put it on the field, it doesn't really matter anyway. So you want to make sure that what you're putting on the field is the closest thing to what you think is good for your students at that point, right, Richard?
Absolutely. And you may be tweaking it as you go. I mean, you may start the design in January and still be tweaking at the end of May before you start teaching. And that's the process. That's just part of the process. So don't be afraid of that.
And the other piece of it is maybe you know how the beginning is going to work and you know how the ending is going to work, and maybe the middle is where your question marks are. It's okay to have the beginning and the end in mind. In fact, that's not a bad premise to start from anyway, so that you know what the beginning and the end is going to be, and it makes sometimes the filling in the middle a little bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, everyone. Well, have a great rest of your week, and we appreciate you joining us for our Tuesday morning coffee talks, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks for hanging with us, everyone. Take care.